Imagine a town vibrant and bustling one day, then completely gone the next. Not a fire, not a flood, but a complete vanishing act in 1902, leaving behind only chilling whispers and eerie remnants. What forces could have emptied an entire American settlement without a trace? It began with a whistle that never answered back. On the morning of October 17, 1902, the railway crew passing through Plumridge slowed their train as they always did, waiting for the station master's signal. But instead of the usual wave of a lantern, they saw something else: stillness. A kind of stillness that felt staged, like the entire town was holding its breath. Smoke rose from chimneys. Horses shifted nervously at hitching posts. A pot of stew simmered on a stove inside the diner, steam pressing against the cold window. But not a single voice echoed through the streets. Not a single door moved. Not a single person stepped forward. It was as if the town had paused itself mid-moment. First man who dared step off the train called out, his voice cracking against the quiet. No answer. Another crewman pushed open the barber shop door, finding the chair still warm. Razor on the floor as if dropped in a rush. Lanterns glowed faintly in every building, their flames struggling, as though they'd been burning unattended for hours. And then someone asked the question that froze every one of them. Where are the people? Trailing footprints led away from the main street into the forest, hundreds of them, pressed deep into the mud as though the townsfolk had fled together. But the unsettling part wasn't where they went, it was where they stopped. Tracks ended abruptly in a clearing only a few hundred feet in. No drag marks, no signs of panic, no bodies, just footprints that simply ceased, like their owners were swallowed whole by the air. What the crew didn't know not yet was that Plumridge had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to notice what the town already suspected in the days before it vanished, that something had replaced the silence of night, something that hummed beneath the earth and moved through the trees just out of sight, as though testing the edges of the town's fear. And whatever it was, it did not come for one person. It came for all of them. The sudden silence over Plumridge was first noticed by the railway crew long before anyone set foot inside the town. Crew had passed this route hundreds of times, and every morning carried the same familiar rhythm, the distant hiss of the locomotive cooling as the train slowed, the station master's lantern swinging like a small sun in the fog, and the comforting noise of a town waking up. Plumridge was never a particularly large place, but it was alive in all the ways that mattered. Roosters crowed before sunrise. Miners clattered out of their cabins. Dogs barked. Children shouted. Wagons creaked down the dirt road as the blacksmith hammered away. There was always something stirring, something moving, something human in the air. That was why on October 17, 1902, the quiet hit the crew like a physical force. It wasn't peaceful or calm. It was wrong. Too clean. Too absolute. A kind of silence that felt planned, as if every sound had been scooped out of the world and locked away beneath the earth. The train's brakes screeched louder than usual, echoing through the valley. And yet nothing answered back, not the clang of a bucket, not a horse's snort, not even the wind brushing past the wooden buildings. The crew exchanged confused glances. The station master was always the first to appear, wiping his hands on a cloth. Grouchy but reliable. Today, the platform was empty, the signal booth dark. Tracks glistening with dew like no one had stepped near them since the night before. One of the younger crewmen leaned out the window, squinting. Maybe they're late, he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. People didn't oversleep as a whole town. People didn't forget to wake up together. As the train rolled to a slow stop, the crew felt an uneasy tug in their chests. Something was off. Something was missing. A senior crewman, Walt Brenner, jumped down from the train, boots crunching against gravel. He called out toward the main street, a simple greeting he always used. His voice stretched far across the open space, but instead of bouncing back with life, it fell flat. Dead, absorbed by the still air like it had no permission to return. That was when the others noticed the smoke. It curled from chimneys in thin, steady ribbons, not the frantic bursts of someone rushing to warm their home, but the absent-minded continuation of fires that had been left burning far too long. The smell of burning wood drifted toward them, warm and comforting in every other circumstance, but today it felt like a warning. Fires don't keep themselves alive. Someone has to tend them, and yet not a single hand stirred a single ember. One crewman pointed to the hitching post outside the general store. Two horses stood there, reins tied neatly, heads shifting with discomfort. They weren't wild or panicked. They were waiting for someone who had tied them there and simply never returned. tin cup lay on the ground beside the trough. A jacket hung over a railing. A wheelbarrow sat mid-path as if someone had paused for a moment and never came back to finish what they were doing. Nothing appeared broken or chaotic. Everything looked paused, suspended between one breath and the next. The crewmen walked cautiously toward the main street, boots heavy on the boards, their footsteps sounding too loud in the eerie quiet. The deeper they moved, the more they felt the creeping realization that whatever had happened here had not taken place slowly over hours. It had been sudden, sweeping, absolute. An entire town does not fall silent all at once, unless something powerful enough, terrifying enough forces every voice into stillness, without leaving a trace of resistance or warning. When the investigators arrived in Plumridge later that same morning, the railway crew had already spread word of the eerie stillness, and the sheriff from the neighboring county led the first team into town. They walked in expecting some form of explanation and outbreak and evacuation, maybe even a staged prank by the townspeople, but the moment they stepped past the station platform and into the open street, all those possibilities dissolved. What they found was a place frozen unnaturally in motion, as if life had been halted mid-sentence. A rocking chair on a porch still swayed lightly, creaking in the breeze, though the air around them was nearly still. A kettle whistled faintly on a stove inside the nearest home, its lid rattling as steam pushed through, but no one stood near it to pull it off the flame. The warmth of the house suggested the family had been there not long ago. Their breakfast plate spread, half-buttered, eggs cooling sat untouched on a wooden table. The sheriff paused at the door frame, uneasy. People leave homes. They do not leave meals in progress. As the investigators spread through the town, every direction offered another unanswered question. Barbara's razor lay on the floor beside a chair still draped with a cloth, as though the customer had vanished while being shaved. A row of laundry hung behind a cabin, damp shirts fluttering slightly, but the cloth espan that should have held the last shirt was on the ground as if someone dropped it mid-task. The saloon, glasses of whiskey sat on the counter, some half-empty, others filled to the brim. A card game appeared to have stopped mid-round, the cards lay splayed on the table. Poker chips scattered from a hand someone had abruptly abandoned. Not a single sign suggested disorder, no overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle. Nothing dragged or broken. Everything looked interrupted, like life had been paused with a single unseen gesture. An investigator walked into the post office and found a letter in the process of being sealed, the wax still soft, the stamp lying beside it. Another wandered into the schoolhouse and found chalk dust hanging in the air, as if someone had brushed the board moments before they entered. The room smelled of ink, wooden desks, and the faint perfume of children's hair ribbon, but there was no laughter, no tiny footsteps, no teacher calling names. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but every second it marked felt heavier, louder, as though the sound deepened the emptiness rather than filling it. A hat rested on a student seat. A slate board lay on the floor with a faint smudge of writing, like a note a child didn't have time to finish. The most unsettling discovery came when the sheriff and two deputies entered the diner. Pot of stew simmered on the stove, thick and fragrant, the kind you'd expect to see in a warm, bustling kitchen at midday. 3 bowls had been placed on the counter, spoons beside them, but no hands had touched them. The cook's apron hung neatly on a hook, but the cook himself was nowhere in sight. A plate of biscuits sat cooling beside the window. The sheriff touched the pot, and it was still hot. Whatever had happened to the people of Plumridge had happened recently, so recently that the food hadn't yet had time to cool. The heat felt like an accusation, a reminder that life had been here only moments before something took it away. Outside, the horses tied in front of the general store pawed at the ground restlessly. They weren't starving or injured, they simply felt the wrongness in the air, the absence of human presence. One horse kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting someone to step out. But the woods remained silent. Even birds avoided the branches, not a single chirp broke the stillness. It was as though the natural world itself understood something terrible had passed through. Something that had swept the people of Plumridge out of existence without touching their belongings, without disturbing their routines, without leaving a single clue that made logical sense to anyone. Searching for answers, the first solid clue that something more disturbing than a simple evacuation had taken place came when one of the deputies followed a faint line of impressions in the dirt leading away from the main street. At first, the marks blended with the town's usual tracks, boot prints, wagon wheels, stray animal prints, but the farther he moved from the buildings, the more he realized these footprints were different. different. They were clustered, organized, dozens upon dozens of them facing the same direction, all heading toward the dense forest at the edge of Plum Ridge. He called the sheriff over, and soon the entire investigative team gathered beside the trail, staring at what looked like the final procession of the town's missing population. The sight alone was unsettling enough: prints small and large, men's heavy boots, women's lighter steps, children's tiny, hurried shapes. The ground was soft with morning dew, so the impressions were clear and fresh. Whatever had driven these people into the woods had done so recently, likely within hours of sunrise. But what chilled them wasn't the direction of the tracks, it was the singular order of them. One appeared to be wandering aimlessly, no prints turned back toward town, no signs of panic or running. People of Plum Ridge had walked together calmly in a formation that felt intentional, almost ritualistic, as though they had been guided or summoned by something none of the investigators could yet understand. As they followed the trail deeper into the forest, the morning light dimmed beneath the thick canopy. The air felt heavier, colder, and even the smallest sounds, twigs snapping under boots, leaves rustling, echoed unnaturally, as if the forest itself was amplifying anything human that dared enter. Path wound between trees until it reached a clearing barely a few 100 feet from the edge of town, and it was there that the investigators froze. The footprints continued into the clearing, packed in tight near the center. But then, abruptly, they stopped. Not faded, not scattered. They simply ended. A pair of large boot prints sat inches from a gnarled root, then nothing. A child's tiny impressions halted mid-stride, as if the next step had landed on air. The sheriff crouched and brushed his fingers across the soil, expecting to find disturbed earth or signs of people kneeling or falling. But the dirt was smooth. No drag marks, no deep scuffs, no sign of bodies or movement beyond that final step. It was as though the entire population had walked into the clearing and then been wiped out of existence in the same instant. One deputy muttered that the prints looked like they belonged to ghosts practicing how to vanish, his voice trembling as he spoke. Another investigator tried to reason that perhaps the townsfolk had lifted onto a wagon or climbed the trees, but the branches overhead were undisturbed, the bark unmarked, and no wagon tracks led in or out. The more they searched, the more the clearing felt like a boundary, an invisible line where something had taken over, something powerful enough to erase 100 people. Without leaving a drop of blood, a torn piece of clothing, or any sign, they had continued moving. The sheriff instructed the team to spread out and examine the forest floor, but their steps only heightened the dread. Every investigator noticed the same strange detail. The silence here was even deeper than in town. Not a bird call, not the buzz of an insect, not the rustle of a small creature moving through the brush. It was as though life itself refused to exist in that space. One of the men knelt to study a child's footprint and noticed how sharply defined it was. The heel pressed firmly into the mud, the toes pointed forward, the final mark of a step that never completed. He whispered that the child must have been walking normally, unafraid, unaware that anything was about to happen. This detail rattled them more than anything else. These people were not running or resisting. Whatever they had followed, whatever drew them into the trees, had done so with calm influence, almost a quiet command. And it was that unnatural calmness that haunted the investigators most, because the prints ending so suddenly suggested that the townsfolk had not simply fled, they had obeyed something that led them to this clearing and then consumed them in a way no natural explanation could justify. The discovery of the sheriff's diary came almost by accident, found by one of the younger investigators who wandered into the abandoned office hoping to find maps, reports, anything that could help them piece together what had happened. The sheriff of Plum Ridge, Amos Calhoun, was known to be meticulous, a man who wrote everything down from petty thefts to weather changes, so the team expected to find orderly ledgers and neat handwriting. Instead, they found chaos. Papers scattered across the desk, ink spilled down the wooden surface, drawer handles bent as though someone had yanked them open in a hurry, and half tucked under a fallen lamp was a leather-bound journal, its edges darkened by something that had singed the cover. The young investigator called out, and within moments the others crowded around him, drawn not only by the find but by the strange smell rising from it, a faint burnt odor mixed with something metallic, something almost like heated stone. The sheriff carefully lifted the journal, and the pages made a brittle crackling sound, as if they had been exposed to heat but not entirely consumed. First few pages were ordinary lists of fines issued, small disputes, notes about livestock going missing. Then the handwriting began to change. The neat script grew uneven, rushed drifting into the margins. Words were scratched out, rewritten, then overwritten again as if Calhoun had been struggling to explain something he didn't fully understand. The earliest strange entry was from 3 nights before the disappearance. In it, Calhoun wrote about a low humming sound that came from beyond the tree line. Vibration that rattled glass in the windows but seemed so faint that most people dismissed it as distant thunder. He noted that the sound lasted only a minute but returned the next night, longer, deeper, until even the horses refused to sleep, and the dogs barked at the forest as if warning something unseen to stay away. As the entries progressed, the sheriff's words grew more frantic. He wrote about townspeople reporting lights flickering above the woods, soft at first, then bright enough to cast long shadows across the ground. Some claimed the lights weren't from the sky at all, but from the earth, rising like a glow beneath the roots. Calhoun tried to investigate, stepping into the forest with 2 deputies, but he confessed that the moment they crossed the first line of trees, the humming grew so strong it felt like it was inside their bones. They turned back, shaken, telling the townsfolk the forest was unsafe after dark. 2 days before the disappearance, an entry described something more unsettling. A young boy claimed he heard whispers outside his window. Not voices exactly, but something that mimicked the rhythm of speech, like a person trying to imitate human sound without knowing the words. Calhoun visited the boy's home that night and wrote that he too heard the faint whispering, drifting from the direction of the woods. It stopped whenever he tried to approach but returned the moment he stepped away, almost playful in its timing. The sheriff admitted in the journal that the town was beginning to panic quietly, though no one wanted to admit it aloud. He described a meeting with the mayor, who insisted they keep everyone calm and forbid anyone from going into the forest. The final entry was the one that made every investigator's skin crawl. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smeared as if written with shaking hands. Calhoun wrote that the humming had returned at dawn, louder than before, and that he saw a blue shimmer weaving through the trees like a breath made visible. Ground vibrated beneath his feet. He ended the entry mid-sentence, describing a sudden flash of light from the woods so bright it swallowed the horizon. The last written words were, "If it moves again tonight, we will not be able to stop it. It wants something. It has been waiting." And the line after that wasn't written with ink at all. It was a dark streak scorched into the page, as though something hot had passed over the journal. The sheriff was still writing, leaving behind a silent, unanswered final mark. Inside the small wooden schoolhouse at the northern edge of Plum Ridge, the investigators had expected to find the same eerie stillness that settled over the rest of the town, desks untouched, books half open, maybe a few stray chalk marks left behind by students who vanished mid-lesson. They found all of that, but they also found something that none of them could explain. Something that made several men step back instinctively as if the air itself had turned colder. When they noticed it, on the far wall, just above the line of small desks, was a row of drawings pinned neatly in place. Children's drawings, brightly colored in crayons and charcoal. But instead of houses, smiling families, and farm animals, they depicted scenes so unsettling that the investigators struggled to understand how children could imagine them without having seen something terrifying with their own eyes. At first glance, the drawings seemed messy, chaotic scribbles. But the closer they looked, the clearer the patterns became. Nearly every drawing showed the town of Plum Ridge, drawn with shaky but recognizable detail: the church steeple, the mine entrance, the line of cabins beneath the ridge. In each picture, the town sat under the night sky, but the sky wasn't filled with stars. Instead, it was dominated by a massive shape blotting out the moon, a shadow so large it stretched across the length of the paper. The children had drawn it with heavy black strokes, some adding streaks of dark blue or red around the edges as if trying to capture a glow or aura. And beneath the shadow, all the little stick figure people had their arms raised, not in greeting, but in fear. The most disturbing part came from the details. One drawing, obviously done by a very young child, showed the shadow with dozens, maybe hundreds of lines extending from it, like legs or tendrils stretching down to the rooftops. Another drawing depicted the shadow crouched behind the forest, with only the tips of those leg-like shapes curling through the trees. In several drawings, the children had scribbled strange symbols around the shadow, Shapes the investigators didn't recognize, spirals, zigzags, and patterns that repeated from picture to picture, as if the children were trying to copy something they had seen glowing or moving in the dark. The sheriff studying the drawings felt unease settle into his stomach like a weight. These weren't imaginative monsters from bedtime stories. They were too consistent, too uniform. Children of different ages, different levels of skill, had all drawn nearly the same thing. Something towering, something formless yet alive. Something that didn't walk on normal legs but on appendages that twisted and hung like cords of shadow. He noticed something else after a few minutes. Many of the drawings had faint smudges near the edges, as if small hands had trembled while coloring them, leaving trails where the crayon slipped across the page. One of the older investigators pointed out a picture pinned slightly higher than the rest. A child had drawn the forest with thick, heavy strokes of green and black, but hidden within the trees were two bright white circles, positioned like eyes staring out from the darkness. They weren't shaped like human eyes. They were perfectly round, hollow-looking, as though the child had tried to draw a gaze that didn't blink. Under those eyes, the child had written a single, shaky word. It. The schoolroom itself felt colder the more they studied the drawings. A draft moved through the building even though the windows were shut. Chalk dust drifted lazily through the air, as if disturbed by something that hadn't walked on two legs. As they continued searching the room, an investigator found a stack of extra pictures in the teacher's desk drawer. These were older drafts of the same drawings, places where the children had tried again and again to capture the shape more accurately. Some had been pressed so hard with crayons that the paper nearly tore, as though the children had been desperate to make the adults understand what they'd seen outside their windows at night. Others had faint pencil notes scribbled in corners. It stood over the trees. It makes a noise in the dark. It comes when the lights go off. The final picture they uncovered was not pinned to the wall, but lying on the teacher's desk, half covered by a stack of attendance sheets. It showed the playground behind the schoolhouse at dusk, swings hanging still, the slide dark and empty. Behind the playground, rising above the fence, was the massive shadow the children kept drawing. But this time, the shadow wasn't looking at the town. It was looking directly at the school. Its blank white circles aimed toward the children's classroom window, as if watching and waiting for something only the children had understood, before the adults ever realized what had been creeping toward. Plumridge in the nights leading up to their disappearance, the old mine, sat on the far edge of Plumridge, a scar carved into the hillside decades before most of the investigators were even born. Everyone in the neighboring counties knew the story. The Plumridge mine had been sealed shut after a cave-in claimed the lives of 12 workers. The incident was so catastrophic and so steeped in rumor that the mine became a place parents warned their children about. A place the older folks claimed was cursed long before the collapse. So when the investigators inched their way toward the entrance that morning, they expected to find the same heavy timber door that had been hammered shut in 1884, rusted hinges, iron braces, warnings scrawled across weathered boards. Instead, they found the door wide open, and not broken open or torn down, but pulled aside with eerie precision, as if someone had carefully removed the barricade rather than forcing their way through it. The chains that once wrapped tightly around the beams lay in the dirt neatly coiled, rust flaking like dry blood where the links had been cut. The wood showed no signs of struggle. It almost looked as though the mine had opened itself. The entrance yawned in front of them, a long, dark corridor leading into the earth. Cool air breathed from within, carrying a faint metallic scent that triggered uneasy glances among the men. It smelled like old stone, coal dust, and something else, something alive and faintly sour, like breath trapped underground for too long. The sheriff hesitated before stepping inside, knowing the mine hadn't been touched for nearly 20 years. There should have been collapsed beams, unstable walls, loose rock everywhere. Instead, the passage looked strangely preserved. Old lantern hooks still lined the walls. Abandoned equipment, pickaxes, broken carts, rusted rails lay exactly where they would have been left before the collapse. But everything was too clean, too undisturbed. Dust coated the floor, yet their boots didn't kick up nearly as much of it as they expected, as if someone or something had moved through the mine recently and stirred the air just enough to keep the dust from settling. THICK a few yards deeper, they noticed claw-like grooves etched into the stone walls. Not from tools, these marks curved in unnatural patterns, long and looping, as though something with many limbs had scraped against the rock while passing through. The grooves were fresh. The stone around them felt sharp, not worn or eroded. One of the deputies ran his fingers along the deepest mark and pulled back immediately, swearing under his breath. The rock felt warm. The tunnel sloped downward into a broader chamber that should not have existed. According to every record, collapse had sealed off the upper shafts and buried deeper sections completely. Yet here they stood inside a cavern large enough to house several wagons, lit faintly by a bluish glow that seemed to seep from the rock itself. It wasn't natural light. It wasn't fire or lantern flame. It pulsed faintly as though breathing, casting long, trembling shadows across the uneven walls. The investigators stepped further in, their voices barely above whispers. At the center of the chamber lay the remnants of an old mining cart tipped on its side, wheels half buried in dirt. But next to it, carved into the stone floor, were symbols identical to those in the school children's drawing spirals, tagged lines and shapes that made the men instinctively uneasy, as though the patterns themselves held meaning their minds weren't meant to understand. As they circled the chamber, someone pointed to the far wall where more fresh grooves marred the stone. This time, the marks weren't random. They formed a pattern, vertical series of lines descending from the ceiling like fingers or limbs pressing downward. The stone beneath those marks bulged, cracked slightly, as though something had once pushed against it from the other side. A thick, unsettling warmth radiated from that wall, almost like heat still lingered behind it, pulsing faintly and slow. Rhythmic waves, the sheriff's flashlight flickered once, the beam stuttering as if the air itself interfered with the light. In that brief dimming, the men swore they saw movement, something shifting in the deepest corner of the chamber, something that slithered or recoiled into the stone like a shadow trying to hide. When the light steadied again, the corner was empty, but the feeling that they had just missed seeing something impossible lingered in the room, tightening around them like invisible hands. When the investigators returned to the center of Plumridge, shaken by what they had seen in the mine, unsettled by the drawings scattered through the schoolhouse, they decided to regroup inside the town hall, hoping to gather whatever documents might still remain. The building was old but sturdy, its wooden frame creaking faintly as if reacting to their presence rather than the wind. As they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. It felt heavier than the air outside, thicker and strangely charged. The hall smelled of dust, candle wax, and something faint beneath it, a mineral scent, almost the same metallic tang they had smelled in the mine. Stacks of files lay open on the long central table, as if the townspeople had been reviewing records or arguing over something urgent, shortly before they vanished. But amid the papers was a torn map of Plumridge and its surrounding forest, covered in markings. Someone had circled the abandoned mine several times, drawn an X over the western ridge, and scribbled strange shapes along the riverbank. These shapes matched the symbols carved into the stone underground, and the markings drawn by the children. The sheriff traced one with his finger, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. It was becoming impossible to deny that whatever had been happening in Plumridge had been building for weeks, maybe even months. As they studied the map, temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that their breath began to fog. The windows rattled softly, even though the sky outside was clear. One of the deputies stepped back instinctively, startled by something near the far wall. There, hanging crookedly, was a framed photograph of the townspeople taken earlier that year, and with mining equipment, women in simple dresses, children smiling awkwardly, all gathered in front of the church for an annual celebration. But as the investigators stared at the photo, they realized something was wrong. They had seen this picture before. It had been sent to the county office months earlier, but the version they remembered did not look like this. In the original, the forest behind the townspeople had been calm, just a backdrop of trees and shadows. But in the version hanging on the wall now, those shadows seemed different. They were thicker, deeper, shaped in such a way that it felt like something was behind the trees, watching. At first, the men thought their eyes were playing tricks on them, but the longer they stared, the more the shadows resembled long, thin limbs stretching downward, barely visible unless someone focused every ounce of attention on them. One of the younger investigators insisted it was just a trick of the light, an illusion from the aged photograph, but the sheriff disagreed. He reached out and removed the frame from the wall. The back of the photograph was warm, as if someone had pressed a hot hand against it moments before they entered. The The shadows seemed even darker now, the shapes more distinct, and in the far center, between two trees, was a faint outline of something tall, something that didn't belong, a suggestion of a narrow torso, and elongated limbs drawn not with ink but with the absence of light itself. Before anyone could speak, a loud thud echoed from the back of the building. The noise was sharp, sudden, like something heavy had dropped onto the floor. The men froze. Another thud followed, closer this time, coming from the hallway that led to the mayor's office. The sheriff raised his lantern and motioned for the others to follow, though none of them wanted to. As they moved toward the sound, the floorboards groaned as if reacting not to the steps, but to something moving beneath them. The hallway ahead darkened even though the lantern flame grew brighter, and the air felt charged with a low vibration, similar to the humming described in Amos Calhoun's journal. When they reached the office, the door was ajar, swaying gently as if someone had just entered or just left. Inside, several documents lay scattered across the floor, but one item stood out, a large ledger cracked open on the mayor's desk, its pages trembling slightly as though stirred by unseen breath, and scrawled across the open page, written in thick charcoal strokes that none of the men recognized as belonging to any town official, were the words, "It comes when the last light dies," as the final clue began to unravel. Those who dared to step inside the ruins of the vanished town realized that the true horror had never been the disappearance itself, but what remained suspended in that strange pocket of time, a place where the air felt unnaturally thick and the ground hummed with a low vibration that seemed to vibrate straight into their bones, as if the land was whispering a warning too old and too broken to be understood and yet impossible to ignore, because every step forward felt like drifting deeper into someone else's nightmare. The journal entries found scattered in the debris describe how, in the days before the town vanished, people had started waking up at the exact same time, 3:11 a.m., each of them reporting a trembling sound coming from beneath their homes, like a heartbeat tapping against the floorboards, slow at first, then steadily growing faster with every passing dawn. No one could explain why clocks stopped working, why animals refused to enter the town center, or why the local pastor, his final sermon ended with him screaming for everyone to leave before the cycle resets, a phrase repeated in frantic handwriting across the inside of his abandoned church walls. When investigators later tested the soil, they found an inexplicable electromagnetic pattern that didn't match any known geological phenomenon, pulsing in intervals that mirrored the timeline of the town's existence, almost as if the land itself remembered what had happened and was replaying it in broken rhythms. Even more disturbing was the discovery of a set of footprints that appeared days after the last resident had been confirmed missing, prints that were deeply sunken into the mud, as if whoever made them was far heavier than a human trailing off toward the forest, and stopping abruptly at a spot where the trees were twisted, as though something colossal had passed through them and bent them out of its way. Those who camped overnight near the site claimed they heard hushed voices, carried by the wind, not speaking but muttering like an entire town whispering the same thought, at once begging to be heard, while shadows stretched unnaturally long beneath the moonlight, bending in directions the bodies attached to them did not move. Final chilling details surfaced when archivists restored the last remaining telegraph sent from the town the night before it disappeared. A half-finished message crackling through static that read, "If anyone is receiving this, the lights have returned in the fields." There before the transmission cut, leaving the last word lost forever. And now, over a century later, the land remains untouched, fenced off not by the government but by the locals themselves, who refuse to let anyone disturb what they believe is a wound in the earth, a place where time folded in on itself and trapped whatever force took the town that night. Because every so often, just before dawn, the faint glow of old street lamps flickers in the empty field, as if the town is trying to return for a moment, trying to breathe again, trying to tell the world what really happened in 1902 before slipping back into the silence, where it has remained for more than 100 years. Asking for like, comment, and subscribe.